know. I don't know. Nobody liked the topic. I didn't want to go that far. Well, he says what I was thinking, so I go, maybe I shouldn't say that. I hear it out loud. How's everybody doing tonight? It's good to see everyone. Another beautiful day, and glad to see everybody make it out tonight for class. Can anybody remember what we're doing tonight? Wine, or drinking. I titled it wine, I'm not sure why. But basically it'll be drinking. My southern slang there. But drinking alcohol, is it good, bad, okay, allowed, not allowed, and different questions. And if you remember last week when we ended, and I mentioned what we'd be studying on tonight, I said we'd open class up, and I actually brought a clipboard just to make it the way I did it last time. And I did it with the youth group, and we had some parents and adults there, and they joined in. But I wanted to start the class off with whether it's a question you've got on a verse and you've never heard a good answer, or a confusing verse, or you just got questions, you've never really looked at the topic, and I also kind of led into it saying just because you ask a question doesn't mean you drink at home when nobody's looking, doesn't mean anything like that, and it may be you had a good answer, but you still have to argue it over and over. So I kind of wanted to get that so that as we go through these pages in the book, wanted to make sure I get all these questions answered as we go through it. And just one example, because this one we'll cover tonight, is Jesus turned water to wine. A lot of people will use that example as an excuse that it's okay to drink a little bit. Like if you go to Olive Garden and the waitress, the first thing they always do is offer wine, try to get you to buy some wine. So is that okay? Is it not okay? Or if you're at home in the privacy of your home and you're eating an Italian dish, is it okay to drink a little bit of wine? A lot of people like to go to Jesus turned water to wine and that example. So that would be one. So what are some questions or comments you've heard before?
I think it would be all right to use for medicinal purposes. I don't know if I pronounced that word right,
Yep. Okay. All right. Anybody else? Yes. All right. That would be a good one, for sure. Yes, Howard? Okay. Anybody else? All right. That's probably the most popular one.
Some people think it's not what goes in, it's what comes out, too.
All right.
Timothy to drink a little wine for his stomach's sake and his often infirmities, which is kind of what Tom said. That's what I hear.
Yeah, I figured just a little bit, a whole glass.
All right, that phrase, not much wine. All right, that's a good start. Anybody else? All right, if you think of one, let me know. And I did hear a few comments between last Wednesday and tonight, so I know there's more comments. So if you remember one or think of one, be sure to let me know, and we'll cover it or try and cover it before we end. And as I said, I had to guess or had to have some prepared for tonight, so we will get to Jesus turning water to wine. But there's a few preliminary comments we've got to make before we get that far. So it's on page 105, very back of the book. I think it's the last subject. 150. Okay, I just can't read. 150. Thank you. As you notice, the first two pages, we've got a line of verses on the left, a line of verses on the other page, and you kind of see the title on one side, unfermented wine. The other verses relate to fermented wine. All these verses are in the Old Testament, but it's the same example of all the verses in the New Testament. It's the same Greek word, well, in the Old Testament, same Hebrew word used for wine, and in the New Testament, it's the same word, Greek word instead of Hebrew, used for wine. And that's the very first, I guess, paragraph or explanation on this page, is that in the Bible, the word wine's used for unfermented juice and for fermented wine both. And so we've got to use the context that the word's used in. And that's definitely not what we're used to in the English language, because we definitely throw the words out there and you know what it means with the way we talk today. And as you notice on the first page, all these verses listed, we can see that the description of that word wine, or what's being talked about, is either good or neutral, meaning there's no warnings given. And we can see that it's unfermented juice in the description. The first verse we'll just take as an example. Therefore God give thee of the dew of heaven and the fatness of the earth and the plenty of corn and wine. So we know right off the bat, it's just things that you get from your crops, things right off the bat. And there's nothing wrong with what you're getting there. The corn's fine, the wine's fine, and so forth. But just like we did with the Greek, and we'd go to a lexicon, we'll do the same thing with the Hebrew and go to a lexicon. And when I was preparing this class, I noticed something different, and I wasn't prepared, so it took me a little longer getting ready for tonight. But in this verse, it's actually a different word than I was expecting. It's tyros, which means new wine. And when we look at the definition of it, it's wine, fresh or new wine, must, freshly pressed wine. But if you notice, it still calls it wine all the way through. And it even says, in the Strong's definition, that by implication, it's rarely fermented. So I had to go through that whole list, and it's about half and half. Some is tyros, and then some is actually a different word, and it's the word that we see on the other page when we see the actual negative aspect of it, or the warnings against using wine. And we see in every one of these verses from the context that it is fermented wine. And we'll just go to the first verse again, Deuteronomy 32:33, where it says, their wine is the poison of dragons and the cruel venom of asps. So there is no doubt that wine is a bad thing in that verse. So we can see and associate that with defining it as fermented wine. And again, if we go to the lexicon and look at the Hebrew, we see there that wine comes from the word yayin, or however you pronounce that. But the definition of it is just wine. And we see here it's normally fermented by implication, intoxication, and so forth. So we see the definition there. But as I said, it kind of threw me off some of the other verses. When I wrote the book, I wasn't looking at the Hebrew. I just went off the fact knowing that the word was commonly, or the way it's translated into English, means either way. And then when I started and looked up the lexicon, I said, uh-oh. So I went through the verses, but what we find is there's plenty of verses on that first page where it says, by context, it's not fermented, and there's no warning in the verse. Ecclesiastes 9:7 says, go thy way, eat thy bread with joy, and drink thy wine with a merry heart, for God now accepteth thy works. So we see there's no warning there. It's actually good or neutral in the description. In Song of Solomon, chapter 5, verse 1, I am come into my garden, my sister, my spouse, I have gathered my myrrh with my spice. I have eaten my honeycomb with my honey. I have drunk my wine with my milk. Eat, O friends, drink, yea, drink abundantly, O beloved. So in the context there, we can see that the wine there is most likely freshly picked, freshly pressed into juice, because we see they're eating honeycomb. You know, anybody that's went out and gathered honeycomb, you can eat it immediately. It doesn't have to go through a process. So we can see out of the context, there's no warning, no negativity. This is probably unfermented. And it comes from Yayin and not Tyros. And then Psalms 105:15, and wine that maketh glad the heart of man, and oil to make his face to shine, and bread which strengtheneth man's heart. So everything in that verse is positive. So the first phrase, the wine that maketh glad, also is positive. No negativity, no warning. So it fits and goes with the unfermented context. So we can see that. It's a little confusing because the first verse, a couple of verses there, had Tyros. But most verses are, you still have a lot of verses with Yayin. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. But all the negative ones definitely had Yayin. But we have, they're all translated wine into English. So again, we go to every verse you look up in the Bible. You don't have to go to a lexicon. You don't have to spend an hour studying each verse. We know that one single word, wine, is used in our translations. So it takes a context to find out what that word means. So every time you mean wine, you can't automatically mean we're allowed to get drunk because God said, drink your wine and be happy. That doesn't mean go get drunk or go social drink or anything of that nature. So hopefully that didn't confuse anyone because of that first, because it confused me for a little bit. But so in any case, in the Old Testament, when it's translated wine, you got to look at the context to get the definition of what's being talked about there. In the New Testament, we have the same situation. In Ephesians 5:18, we've got a verse that we'll look at later. And do not be drunk with wine, wherein is excess, but be filled with the Spirit. And when we go to the lexicon for that verse, we see that word is onois. And Wesley brought that up Sunday morning, talking about that verse. And every verse in the New Testament does come from a single word, oinois. So when we look at it, it's just defined as wine, or in the metaphorical sense, the fiery wrath of God. We see that several times in the book of Revelation. The word wine is used in that sense. But there is, you can see that definition is pretty small. So you definitely have to use the context in the New Testament to know what's being talked about in the verse you're looking at. So that one, Ephesians 5:18, is obviously fermented wine. There's warning against it. We're told not to do it. So it obviously would fall in that category. But as we look at other verses in the New Testament, Luke 5, verses 37 and 38, and no man putteth new wine into old bottles, else the new wine will burst the bottles and be spilled, and the bottles shall perish. But new wine must be put into new bottles, and both are preserved. When we look at that story and what's being taught in that situation, and then we look at culture and how they would ferment and just how wine would act, the bottles, whether it was an old bottle or a lot of times it would be animal skin used to make a bottle or a container. And if you put brand new juice in there, over time, if it started fermenting and started expanding, the old bottle or the old skin that they had used would break because it didn't have any more elasticity in it. So that's why you would have to make sure you used a new bottle. So you can see there's an act of fermentation and expansion and an increase in pressure going on. So you know that when it says here wine, the new wine is going to be fresh grapes or fresh juice. So it gives you an indication of context that it's not fermented wine being put into new bottles or old bottles. So we can see that word, just if we stopped right then, we'd see that it can go either way. And then when we go to a lexicon, we see that it's the same word oinos used in this situation or in this verse. So we can see right off the bat the word goes either way. And Wesley mentioned this Sunday morning also. Matthew 19:21. Here another parable. There was a certain householder which planted a vineyard, hedged it round about, and digged a wine press in it, and built a tower and let it out to husbandmen, and went into a far country. So when we look this up, the word for wine press comes from linos, which is a different word, but what we see with it is it's either a tub, something underneath, or it's going to be a vat dug into a ground or so forth, or we understand the wine press sometimes is something they climb into and would walk on it to crush the grapes. But we see here it's the new wine coming out of the press and is collected in a wine press or so forth. So again, we see fresh juice coming out of the grapes that are being pressed or crushed. So just the fact of wine press, we know it's unfermented juice that's coming out of this press. But again, the word wine being used. So we can see that the context has to be used to figure out what's being talked about. And just to kind of tie the Old Testament yayin and the New Testament oinos together, if we look at Isaiah 16:10, it reads, "And gladness is taken away, and joy out of the plentiful field, and in the vineyards there shall be no singing, neither shall there be shouting. The treaders shall tread out no wine in their presses. I have made their vintage shouting to cease." So it's kind of like that one word for wine presses, but here it just talks about no wine coming out of the presses. So we got fresh juice that would be or should be coming out of presses. But in the Old Testament, if you look this up in the lexicon, it would be yayin for wine. But obviously we see that it's unfermented juice. And then in the lexicon, or not the lexicon, the Septuagint, which is, or who remembers what the Septuagint is, however you pronounce that? All right, it's the Old Testament translated in Greek about 200 BC. And what's significant about that is the scholars that knew Hebrew also knew Greek. So they would go and take the word, and they'd see where it's yayin in the Old Testament Hebrew. And when they were translating it for the Greek, which at that time Greek was the spoken language throughout most of the world, it was actually the word oinos in the Septuagint. So we see that word, Old Testament or New Testament, when it's translated to wine for us in English, it goes either way. We've got to see what the context is so that we know what the definition is. So you know, if you like to put notes in your book, and that's what I do, you know, we see here that, and that's why I said it was kind of like preliminary notes before we went into some of these questions and comments that people are making or we're going to answer and look up, is just because we see the word wine in a verse does not mean it's automatically fermented or it's alcoholic that we think of today. We've got to look at the context, whether it's in the Old Testament or the New Testament, to determine what that word means. So up to this point, does anybody have any questions or comments, or, as Wesley says, observations? All right. As we move on, another one, I guess I could have used this as an example of a comment. A lot of times we hear that it all had to be fermented back then because the ancients didn't have any way of preserving grape juice. And, you know, we kind of think of that because we're so spoilt in our modern day. We've got refrigerators, we've got expiration dates on bottles, and all these different reasons. So we're in the mindset of they couldn't preserve the grape juice. Zondervan Pictorial Bible, it's got different skills and examples of how they actually did preserve grape juice back then. Centuries ago, millennia ago, and it's pretty easy to find. I've got several books at home talking about this. Some of it's even archaeological evidence where they found a shipwreck in the Mediterranean, and it'll be a 1,000-year-old shipwreck, so it's one of them, you know, long time ago. And when they bring the ship up, it's got bottles and vats of juice in it, and because of the temperature of the water, it's been away from oxygen, it's kind of been sealed at the bottom of the sea, and when they pull it up and just because of the ship and different things they find, they know it's several hundred years old or even 1,000 years old. And the juice, not that it's good enough to drink and taste good, but it's not fermented. But yet it is that old. So juice just doesn't automatically ferment just because it's been squeezed out of a grape. And I think that's a misconception a lot of people have just because of our ease of life that we have these days. And I want to warn you before I go through this phase, I simplified this as much as I could, talking about going from grape juice to alcohol beverage. All right? So don't criticize me if it's not complicated enough. I went as simple as I could. And took it from a book and different people explaining the process. But grape juice to alcohol just doesn't happen by accident. You have to add sugar of some amount, and you still have to add yeast, and then you go through a fermentation process and you come up with alcohol. And I can't remember from my notes, when I made the notes, there's another process. Gluten can get there accidentally or added instead of sugar, but it still has to have yeast added to it, and it still has to go through a fermentation process to become alcohol. And the whole point of this wasn't to get complicated, but just to show that it doesn't happen by accident. You don't just squish some grapes into a bottle, let it sit in your closet, and it turns into nice fine wine. And if you even look at some wine's expensive, some's cheap, they all know what they're doing. They go through a process. It all tastes different depending on all these different factors. It's got to be in sealed containers, right temperature, no light. It's really complicated if you boil down to it. So the ancients knew how to preserve grape juice. They also knew how to make alcoholic wine. There was a process involved. So it's not an accident that many like to kind of lean to and say that that's what happened. So up to that point, does anyone have any questions or comments? All right. So that's just kind of some preliminary before we get into the next page. So if you flip the page over to page 152, normally we just start at the top and go to the bottom, but here we're actually going to start at this blank page at the bottom. I know that sounds kind of funny, but the first example we're going to look at tonight, or question we'll look at, is John 2, verses 1 through 11, where Jesus turned water into wine. And I didn't put this in the book, and the reason was there's really no use for it on this page as published because you can't explain anything. And if you remember, on the very first page, not very first, but in the front, right behind the table of contents, or in front of it, is kind of an explanation of how to use this book. It talks about it's not a replacement for the Bible. The Bible still has to be used to study it. It goes through which translations were used. But what you notice in here is there is no commentary in this book. It is all verses. They are grouped together, so you could have an argument there. But there's no commentary or explanation of verses throughout this book. The commentary is for us. And that's what that last phrase says. Is there space left in the book? Verses are grouped together or spaced in between each other for us to make our own notes to help us study, help us to explain to others. So that's why when I said we're going to go start with the blank part down here at the bottom, that's what I meant by that. Is we're going to start with Jesus turning water into wine and see why this first miracle of Jesus can't be used to justify social drinking or drinking fermented wine. So what we'll do is read all 11 verses. I know it's long, but I think it's important to see the whole context of what we're looking at. So starting in verse 1, "And the third day there was a marriage in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there, and both Jesus was called and his disciples to the marriage. And when they wanted wine, the mother of Jesus said unto him, They have no wine. Jesus said unto her, Woman, what have I to do with thee? Mine hour is not yet come. His mother saith unto the servant, Whatsoever he saith unto you, do it. And there were set there 6 water pots of stone, after the manner of purifying of the Jews, containing 2 or 3 firkins apiece. Jesus saith unto them, Fill the water pots with water. And they filled them up to the brim. And he said unto them, Draw out now, and bear unto the governor of the feast. And they bare it. When the ruler of the feast had tasted the water that was made wine, and knew not whence it was, but the servants which drew the water knew, the governor of the feast called the bridegroom, and said unto him, Every man at the beginning doth set forth good wine, and when men have well drunk, then that which is worse, but thou hast kept the good wine until now. This is the beginning of miracles did Jesus in Cana of Galilee, and manifested forth his glory, and his disciples believed on him. So when we read that, and we kind of put it in an outline as far as the context of tonight's class, we look at it. Jesus and his disciples were invited to a wedding. They go, they attend it. The wedding ran out of wine. And then Mary told the servants to do as Jesus said. So they did. They took 6 water pots of stone, 2 or 3 firkins each. They filled them with water. And then we see the governor of the feast talking about normally people wait till they put the good wine first. Then when men have drunk well, then that which is worse comes out. But thou hast kept the good until now. So he's saying that the bridegroom or whoever had done it in reverse than what they were used to. Does anyone have any questions or comments before we start looking at some of these points? All right. I thought I would just get that last comment out of the way first because it's kind of the easiest one to look at. Where the governor said, most set out the good wine first, and then when men have well drunk, they put out that which is worse, but thou have kept the good wine till now. When we look at it, obviously he's talking about wine. We see the word there a couple times. But we have that that phrase in the middle, when men have well drunk. What do most people automatically think of when they read that phrase or that part of the phrase? All right, most people in the way we talk today, we think they're intoxicated. Part of that is because our brain is always thinking that's we've got a preconceived idea of what this verse means. But, one thing we can look at is if they're well drunk, if they're intoxicated, how do they know this tastes better? They're already drunk. So that's kind of a question to make you think, well, that logic's not necessarily there. But even if you look and say, well, the governor of the feast, he was in charge, so he wasn't drinking like everybody else. So he knew it tasted better. So if you wanted to take that argument, the grammar still doesn't fit the argument. If we look at that, the grammar there, and what I mean by that, when you have well drunk, if you're working out, Mike's talking about cutting hay today, and he's fixing to go roll it and so forth. If you're working outside all day and hot, somebody brings you a bunch of water, you're going to be well drunk with water. It's the same phrase. We normally don't talk quite that way, but that's what we've got to realize is that that's what's meant. You drink a whole lot of water, but that doesn't mean you're intoxicated. You've just drank a lot of that fluid that was given to you. But if we also look at take a fellowship meal, for example. Now here we have, lots of individual cans and so forth and coolers, and then we still have some 2 liters. But at a lot of congregations, there's only 2 liters available, and so forth. And what do we normally see? Because everybody will donate, or there'll be an announcement before the meal, and people will bring a lot of 2 liters, so a lot will show up. You have a whole lot of different brands and so forth. And if you pay attention to the brands and what's brought and what's used first, and then what's used second, it is identical to this verse. And I just used 2 most popular brands. Dr. Pepper and Mountain Dew will be sitting there on the table, and you walk up, and whoever's serving, you tell them what you want. You run out of Mountain Dew, Mountain Lightning shows up. Or Dr. Thunder shows up. They cost half as much. They're not as popular. Some people say they don't taste as good. So you use Dr. Pepper or Mountain Dew first. It's the same situation, same example. So you can't just take that phrase in that verse and make it mean what you want to. You have to take it for what's written and what's meant. So I thought that was pretty easy to dispel or talk away. Does anyone have any questions or not agree? Yes, Ken.
So I had a verse pointed out to me not
Yes. We're getting there. We're getting there. You are correct, though. And no, I didn't share my notes with him. All right, if we back up to verse 6 and 7, and this is an interesting verse. At least I thought it was when this got pointed out to me. So here we have 6 pots. They're full of water, but they're pots used for purifying, by the manner of the Jews. So we can look up secular history and see what that meant. And also it says each one of these pots contained 2 or 3 firkins each. So what's significant about the fact that it was for purifying after the manner of the Jews? Okay, that's one. Luckily, the governor of the feast didn't know that, and it mentions that at the end. But as far as being the manner of purifying, if you remember, the Pharisees were criticized a lot for all the rules they had made, how they had added a lot to God's laws. So you couldn't eat until you washed your hands. You couldn't do this until you washed this. There was a lot of washing, a lot of purifying going on. So they had these big pots full of water, and obviously this was a well-to-do wedding because there was a lot of wine provided, obviously, at the beginning. They had lots of pots of water standing by for use. So we know these are good-sized pots. And then we see here it says they're containing 2 or 3 firkins apiece. So what's a firkin? Nope, not quite.
About 9 gallons, somewhere around there.
All right, about 9 gallons. A lot of well, if you look up, go to the lexicon, and you find the word firkin, and then you look it up. It's just a measurer or a way of measuring a liquid. And it says somewhat less than 9 English gallons, or about 40 liters. Now, they say that phrase like that's identical. And what I found out is it's not. But as Wesley said, about 9 gallons. So a lot of commentaries go with 9 gallons. Where it says somewhat less than 9, some commentaries it'll say it's 7 or 8 gallons. And they'll say because it's purifying pots, it's made out of stone, they're not all identical. They didn't have the FDA back then, so their pots didn't get measured and didn't have to have a sticker. So they're all close to the same size. So it says 7 or 8 gallons makes a firkin. So if we take 7 or 8 gallons, and I put in parentheses 10 gallons because Wayne Jackson had a different number, and I was kind of wondering why is his number a little different, a little higher, and at that definition where it says somewhat less than 9 gallons, so you get 7 or 8, but then it says about 40 liters. So if you go to Google and you go in conversion and go to one of those conversion websites, and it'll have blank liters, blank gallons. You type in 40 liters, and it comes out 10.5 gallons, or 10.55, blah, 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 bunch of numbers. So you say 10 gallons. So I just rounded it to 10. All right? So if we do the math, you had 6 pots, and it says 2 or 3 firkins each. So we'll just go low to start with. 2 firkins, 7 gallons, you get 84 gallons of wine was made. Or if you want to say it's 3 firkins and 7 gallons of firkin, you get 126 gallons. Same thing if you wanted to go with the number 8. If you go with the initial part of the definition, like Wesley said, you get 108 or up to 162 gallons. So some commentaries like to say it was somewhere between 80 and 150 gallons of wine that Jesus made. Wayne Jackson, he said it was between 120 and 180. And if you plug 10 in instead of 9, 7, 8, or 9, you plug 10 in, it'll go 120 to 180 gallons. Now, does it matter whether it was 80 or 180 gallons of fermented alcohol? I don't think so. The end result's going to be the same. It's going to be a lot of unruly people. All right? So, taking that and getting to where Ken was going, if we look at Christ, our Savior, and we go to Hebrews 9, 12 through 15, the writer of Hebrews is comparing the old law and the sacrifice, the blood that was shed by bulls and goats was insufficient. And in verse 14, he talks about Christ and his sacrifice. And he says, how much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, purge your conscience from dead works to serve the living God. Now there's other verses we could use, but this verse tells us, without a doubt, Christ was a perfect, sinless sacrifice made on our behalf. Otherwise his blood wouldn't have done for us what it does. And then what Ken was referring to in Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 15, which Christ was under the old law at the time. This is part of the old law. And we read, woe unto him that giveth his neighbor drink, that putteth thy bottle to him, and makest him drunkest also, that thou mayest look on their nakedness. So if we look at that math and come up, whether you want to go low or high, in the middle, it doesn't matter. When you provide that much alcohol to a wedding feast, if you say it had to be fermented, well then you can't go with Hebrews 9 and say Christ was sinless, because he violated Habakkuk 2. And we all know the Bible is infallible, it doesn't make mistakes, so we know it's unfermented because Christ did not sin. So that wine, when we see it in there, that wine is oinos, which we see all throughout the New Testament. You have to go to the context, see what it means. So we know that in this context, when Jesus turning water to wine, it was unfermented. And of course, we see next to the last verse where they're saying you left the good stuff till the end. All that proves is that Christ is superior to what man had made. And Christ in his miracle took nature. And, it also says it was his first miracle. It shows his power, him being deity, which is the purpose of miracles, or one of the purposes. And it shows his power over nature. Because through the natural process, that ugly drawing I put up there, you take the grapes, press it, get the juice, go through your process, ferment it, or even if you don't do the fermenting process, you go through a process and get grape juice. And that is, in one sense, a natural process, but you have to do something. Man has done that, made juice to drink. And then Jesus, he makes wine unfermented, and it's way superior. So it shows the superiority of Christ, also shows his power over nature, solidifying his deity. Yes, Ken? Okay. And as I said, there's room for making notes. So you could go with 80 to 180 gallons, or you could go 120 to 180, whichever number you want to use. It's a whole lot of gallons. And then you can put Hebrews 9, where Christ was a perfect sacrifice, sinless. Habakkuk 2 would forbid him making fermented wine. So then we know that Jesus did not sin, so he would not have made fermented wine. So you can put some notes in your book if you want to help you remember and how to explain that later on. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Yes, Wes.
As we think about this situation, if Jesus really turned water into an intoxicating beverage, and we're to bring our children up to nurture the admonition of the Lord, we ought to teach them they can drink intoxicating beverages, but do it responsibly, because Jesus taught us that. Now, every person has tried to use John 2 against me to show you can drink. I'd say, so you're teaching your children to drink, true? Oh, no, I wouldn't dare do that. I said, do you know more than our Lord? Our Lord, according to you, is teaching people to drink, and yet you say you wouldn't do it. See, they know it's wrong to do that.
That's right. And so, almost every subject we've looked at, or every subject that we hit that's a big controversial subject, you got to look at the consistency of the Bible. It's always consistent in its explanations. Wesley's explanation of that is all the verses are consistent. If you're trying to say this was fermented wine or alcohol, well then it contradicts more than just Habakkuk 2. It contradicts other principles that we learn in the Scriptures. The same thing with baptism. If you try and talk verses away, there's plenty of verses, 1 Peter 3:20 being the first one, says baptism saves us.
My daddy was an alcoholic. He taught me, Wesley, the drink you don't want to take is your first one. And that's exactly right.
That's right. And that would also show a fallacy of the scriptures, because it's been shown some people take one drink and can't stop after that. Everybody has different physical problems and ailments in this world. And, so that's why it's important. And it does, even that principle or that thought goes with one of the other verses we'll look at next week, as far as is not even starting. And that's why that principle is so important to understand. But that's where we'll pick up next week. If you think of any more questions or comments that you didn't raise your hand and mention, be sure to let me know, and we'll add it to the list. That way we can make sure everything gets answered by the time we finish these pages. Appreciate everybody being here tonight and everybody's participation.